Space, the final frontier.
Its influence extends across the decades and the stars, and has had more spin-offs than a pair of really competitive silkworms. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
Star Trek. Who said space is the final frontier? This guy, and he should know, he's been there for reals. But someone else created the world that would eventually be immortalized by that iconic narration. Gene Roddenberry had been a pilot, a policeman, and a TV writer. He'd written scripts for different genres and been well regarded as a reliable writer when he sold a series called The Lieutenant, about base life in the Marines. After that series was cancelled after one season on air, Roddenberry turned his attention to his next idea, something that could examine the human condition but in a way that would get past the network suits with whom he had clashed on The Lieutenant. Roddenberry clashing with authority types would become something of a theme in his career. But anyway, his next idea, something about space journeys. As TV at the time was all about selling ads, actually it still is, but at the time it would be hard to get a program about a serious social issue of the day broadcast on primetime TV. But when you made the setting a little different, you could tell the story you wanted as an allegory. Best exemplified by Gulliver's Travels, which is not merely a story about a traveller finding himself to be a giant, but was actually a biting commentary of the times in which it was written. Stories that, in times past, without the fantasy elements, might have landed their writer in prison. Allegory lets you talk about hot topics without mentioning them by name, getting past networks, broadcast standards, and without offending advertisers or audiences. Some viewers unable to grasp metaphor, allusion, satire, or irony will happily swallow any social commentary as long as you don't make it literal. You can talk about racism if the people are blue. You can make a statement about the war featuring the Mamericons on Schmiatnam 4, or you can have a crew member not wear his spacesuit correctly and spread a deadly virus on board the ship. Meanwhile, Desilu Studios, then owned by Lucille Ball, was in a vulnerable position. The studio needed to own more properties other than just Lucille Ball's top-rated sitcom, The Lucy Show. One of the pitches they received was from Roddenberry, which he outlined as Wagon Train to the Stars. A large proportion of popular TV dramas at the time seemed to be westerns, and even though the genre had begun its decline, it was an easy comparison to make. If you were trying to sell Star Trek now, you'd say it's just like Real Housewives in space, with drama, advanced makeup effects, and hideous monsters. Desilu executive Herb Solow managed to sell NBC on the idea, despite Gene Roddenberry, who, while he was a gifted writer, was someone who could make a lousy first impression on slick network suits. At the time, NBC was owned by television maker RCA, and in the mid-60s, US networks were transitioning to colour. RCA had had a hand in designing the NTSC colour TV system used in North America. Thanks, RCA. But nowadays are best remembered for naming those annoying cables you need to get out of the box of odds and ends on the top shelf in the garage if you want to connect up an old VCR to a television to watch your ancient VHS recordings of Manimal. If NBC had popular and colourful programs, people might hopefully buy expensive colour television sets made by RCA.
What's in it for me?
What do you want?
A piece of the action.
You do not even know what the action is going to be.
Apart from Lucy's shows, Desilu had previously had the hit series The Untouchables, but by the time of Star Trek, they were mainly renting out studio space to other producers. Along with Star Trek, Desilu made several pilots in different genres, including a police series written by Roddenberry, as well as a pilot for a western that he produced. Desilu, though, was still mainly known for whatever Lucille Ball's series was at the time. If they were to land Star Trek, would such a small studio actually be able to make it, or would it end up looking like a situation comedy?
I said, please don't tell Spock that I said he was the best first officer in the fleet.
Why, thank you, Dr. McCoy.
Not so concerned about his Vulcan eyes, Doctor. He forgot about his Vulcan ears.
As it turned out, when they eventually sold Star Trek as a series in 1966, Desilu also had another of their complicated pilots ordered to series for that same season, Mission Impossible. The difference between Star Trek and other science fiction shows was that the aliens weren't automatically monsters to be killed and exterminated and destroyed and put into camps and exterminated again, this time with nicotine lasers. but potential friends and allies, the sort you might invite to a barbecue, and after finishing off the margaritas, totally strike out with their wife, potentially starting an interstellar war in the process. NBC financed a pilot which was made in 1964 with Jeffrey Hunter cast as Captain Christopher Pike of the Starship Enterprise.
I'm tired of deciding which mission is too risky and which isn't, and who's going on the landing party and who doesn't, and who lives, and who dies.
The pilot episode, The Cage, was expensive for its time and told a rather more highbrow story than NBC was expecting.
Since our lifespan is many times yours,
they thought they were getting pew pew pew, whoosh bang bang, ooga ooga.
This is all some sort of trap.
Instead, they got aliens capturing Captain Pike with a view to having him sire a new race on the planet Talos 4. There were groundbreaking special effects for television, groundbreaking casting with a female first officer on a military vessel.
Sorry, number one. For little information on this planet, we'll have to leave the ship's most experienced officer here covering us.
And an excitable alien guy with pointed ears. The pilot had potential, but wasn't picked up because it was apparently too cerebral.
Brain and brain! What is brain?
In something that almost never happened, NBC said, "Hey guys, why don't you make another one?" Second chances for a failed pilot were as rare as finding a rooster using an indoor voice at sunrise. Hunter was a stoic captain, but appeared a little stiff and uncomfortable a lot of the time. Most of his crew made about as much impression as a paintball pellet on a tiger tank. Quit it. Apart from the guy with the ears. In 1965, having funded development of 3 scripts by different writers, NBC chose Samuel A. Peoples' script Where No Man Has Gone Before as a second pilot. There were caveats though. Make it far cheaper, easier for the audience to digest, and while you're at it, lose the guy with the ears or the woman who was clearly somebody's girlfriend. Even though that somebody was Roddenberry, he decided to nix his future wife's role and instead keep Mr Spock. Awkward. I bet that was never mentioned again. Gene Roddenberry was quickly given the nickname the Great Bird of the Galaxy in an affectionate but also sometimes slightly mocking way by associate producer Robert H. Justman in his frequent inter-office missives. Star Trek was made way before electronic communication, so inter-office banter was distributed via paper memos. Star Trek generated a lot of memos about production issues and script notes, all of which had batteries of secretaries typing out multiple copies before somebody physically delivered the memo. In this environment, if you had a reply all fail, it's only because your secretary really hated you.
They can't actually make you do anything you don't want to.
But they try to trick me with their illusions.
Jeffrey Hunter, according to his wife, was a film star.
We've lost the captain.
And so he was quietly forgotten and replaced by an up-and-coming actor, William Shatner, who would now play Captain James Kirk.
Will you try for one moment to feel? At least act like you've got a heart.
There were new cast members, actually strike that. They were almost completely replaced with only Mr Spock staying on board, with the character portrayed by Leonard Nimoy tweaked to incorporate the former first officer's cold and calculating demeanour.
Have I ever mentioned you play a very irritating game of chess, Mr Spock?
Irritating. Ah, yes. One of your Earth emotions.
Also signing on for this second pilot, a chief engineer, Mr Scott, and astrophysicist Sulu, though neither was actually given a name on screen. The second pilot saw Kirk's old friend turned into a super being, which gave William Shatner a chance to make his mark. He's a lot more easygoing, charming, and human than Hunter, and NBC bought it, with the show now earmarked for a September 1966 debut. Now they just had to make the show in time for their air dates. The uniforms were redesigned again, now in the familiar colours, mustard for command, blue for sciences, and red for everything else, communications, security, engineering, and of course, sudden death. The Federation starship USS Enterprise NCC-1701 was on a 5-year mission exploring the galaxy.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission: to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations.
A Constitution-class starship was the top-of-the-line Starfleet vessel. There were around a dozen of them at this time, though over the show's run, about half of them were destroyed or seriously damaged. a supermarket might write that off as spoilage.
Why?
The Enterprise, representing the United Federation of Planets, had a crew of around 400, was armed with phaser banks and photon torpedoes, equipped with shuttlecraft, matter transporters, a gymnasium, sickbay, conference rooms, and whatever else they needed for an episode. The Enterprise was powered either by sub-light speed impulse engines or warp engines, which could travel many times the speed of light, like the invoice from a toll bridge. Captain James T. Kirk commanded the Enterprise on its 5-year mission to seek out new worlds, new civilizations, all that stuff.
You'll have to get your entertainment someplace else.
Kirk, like practically every lead on these shows, was a ladies' man, with a girl in every port, leaving a trail of heartbreak across the galaxy.
No, Jim.
His true love was the Enterprise, in a totally platonic and not at all creepy way, apart from that one time in the Jeffries tube. Kirk was much more excitable than Pike, and fashioned after the naval captain hero of C.S. Forester's Horatio Hornblower novels.
To James T. Kirk, Captain of the Enterprise.
Much of that excitement came from new star William Shatner, a Montreal-born actor making waves in films and TV. Shatner's ability to breathe life into dull moments, his staccato vocal rhythms that feel like somebody's trying to stream off a poor internet connection.
Because Dr. McCoy is right in pointing out the enormous danger potential.
And, okay, if left unchecked, a tendency to shamelessly overact. Shatner was the series star, but would soon find himself competing, in his own mind at least, with his co-star.
You would extend welcome to invaders?
No. But we would welcome friends.
Commander Spock, usually known as Mr. Spock, was the ship's first officer and science officer, half human and half Vulcan, which means he gets all the weird sex stuff that they could coyly allude to.
Hit me! Harder!
What are you doing, woman?
Leave me alone!
Have you gone dark?
Vulcans live by pure logic, which they use to suppress their emotions. Vulcans have different biochemistry to humans, which proves to be oh so convenient time and time again.
I am endeavoring, ma'am, to construct a mnemonic memory circuit using stone knives and bearskins.
Leonard Nimoy thought of himself as a serious actor and initially wasn't sure how to play a character who displayed no emotion.
Fascinating.
Look at Spock and you'll see he's often on the brink of displaying emotion, but he's got it under control, like having a crippling gambling problem when you work for a bank.
Really, Doctor?
Star Trek, being the sort of science fiction series it was, would have all manner of plots where Spock did indeed show emotion, smile, laugh, and love. But on set, Nimoy stayed in character, which to other actors made him seem about as much fun to be around as having a migraine on a sunny day at the beach. A scene where Spock was to incapacitate someone with a punch annoyed Nimoy, and it was he who suggested Spock have his own way to deal with troublemakers. And thus the Vulcan neck pinch was born.
Pity you can't teach me that.
I have tried, Captain.
Very handy in an emergency, but don't ask Spock for a back rub. Nimoy also adapted a religious gesture into the Vulcan hand salute.
Live long and prosper, Miranda.
Spock was also able to enter people, not like that. A Vulcan technique that proved to be most useful was the linking of minds. Spock was able to initiate a mind meld with someone in order to communicate with an entity, allowing Spock to feel what was being felt. It's one of those things that, if Mr. Spock weren't such a proper guy, it could go so horribly wrong.
My mind to your mind. Your bank account to my bank account.
Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy was the ship's chief medical officer. He likes to think of himself as a simple country doctor, but also one who's not keen on demarcation.
I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer.
And he's someone who really dislikes transporters.
Signed aboard this ship to practice medicine, not to have my atoms scattered back and forth across space by this gadget.
DeForest Kelley had already had a long career often playing villains, but now he would play someone for whom violence was the last resort.
Of course, Mr. Spock. Your reaction was quite logical.
Thank you, Doctor.
In a pig's eye.
McCoy and Spock were, for the most part, frenemies, needling each other whenever the opportunity arose.
You're out of your Vulcan mind, Spock.
The Doctor would accuse Spock of being a computer or a robot.
Are you out of your Vulcan mind?
And likewise, Spock would counter with equally unflattering remarks about the Doctor's lack of logic.
The resulting torrential flood of illogic would be most entertaining.
Kirk, Spock and McCoy would form a tight trio, dominating the adventures. McCoy was the conscience and the heart, Spock was the brain, and Kirk got laid a lot.
I'll certify that right now.
DeForest Kelley was not initially considered a co-star, but merely had a guarantee of a minimum number of episodes. The actor and character, however, proved so important that Kelley was bumped up to co-star for the second season.
Doctor, you are a sensualist.
You bet your pointed ears I am.
Star Trek without Bones McCoy, constant put-downs of Spock and the withering replies just wouldn't be the same.
Well, what do you know? I finally got the last word.
Also, we would have missed this.
He's dead, Jim. He's dead, Jim. He's dead, Jim.
Is this a dead man, Doctor?
Very dead, Mr. Spock. He's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. He's dead. He's dead. Dead, Jim. Dead, Jim. Dead. Bottom of dead. Dead. He's dead, Jim. Dead, Jim.
Star Trek was not an ensemble show as later Trek series were to become, or at least pretend to be. There were a number of regular supporting characters, but only Shatner and Nimoy appeared in every episode. Most had deals that involved a minimum number of episodes. Some of them were occasionally written out of episodes in favour of extras in order to keep the budget down, and some of them only received first names in the 80s or later.
I can't change the laws of physics.
Lieutenant Commander Montgomery Scott was the ship's engineer, usually referred to as Scotty.
You may beam us aboard.
Mr. Scott is dedicated to keeping this ship running. He's a Mr. Fix-It, often tasked with the impossible. He's also not given a huge amount of character outside of his love of scotch, or work in engineering, or drinking hard liquor. He occasionally chases women half his age, and has a love of hard liquor.
Does it make a good mix with scotch?
Canadian actor James Doohan felt a Scottish accent would work best for an engineer. Wait, what? Scotty's Scottish? What? Who knew?
My poor parents.
Scotty had a strong sense of loyalty and propriety. He was protective of his engines, his booze, and was a dab hand with a pun.
Before they went into warp, I transported the whole kit and caboodle into the air engine room, where there'll be no trouble at all.
Of course, one of Star Trek's best-known catchphrases was never said by Scotty, but referenced him.
Beam us up. You may beam us aboard. Scotty, beam us up fast. Beam me up.
Beam me up, Scotty has to date never been said in that exact form in any official Star Trek production.
Tell me how your planet Vulcan looks on a lazy evening when the moon is full.
Vulcan has no moon, Miss Uhura.
I'm not surprised, Mr. Spock.
Lieutenant Uhura was the ship's communications officer in charge of sending and receiving and decoding messages, though on occasions she entertained the entire crew with her singing, all of whom enjoyed her repertoire.
Oh, on the Starship Enterprise!
Apart from Kevin Riley, who was mainly upset because his crewmates ignored his polka dubstep remixes on SoundCloud.
I made a tape of it, sir.
Some episodes give Uhura a larger part of the plot, such as Mirror Mirror or Trouble with Tribbles, but often the character was relegated to switchboard operator.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
Leading to actress Nichelle Nichols to consider leaving the series after the first year until she was convinced to stay by Dr. Martin Luther King.
Sometimes I think if I hear that word frequency once more, I'll cry.
Lieutenant Sulu was the ship's helmsman, interested in botany, weapons, and vehicles.
I know it's a crazy coincidence, but I've always wanted one like this. Found it lying right over there.
Sulu is energetic, interested in various forms of combat and transport. He's the go-to young crewman for most of the first season. He gets to go nuts with a sword, later gets a nasty mirror universe twin.
I knew he would.
George Takei had a number of episodes slated to feature Sulu in the second season, but he was detained filming a movie with John Wayne, the Green Berets, which gave a new co-star a chance to shine in those episodes. Sulu does, however, spend a lot of time being possessed.
What?
I saw George Takei at a convention in the mid-90s. He barely mentions Star Trek at all, instead regaling us with stories of trying to get a passport at the last minute. That was $100 really well spent.
It's a very painful affair, I can tell you.
I am for Sulu.
Shift positions.
Captain, we can no longer protect each other.
Yeoman Rand was the captain's assistant for the first half of the first season, someone to flirt with the captain, but the roles written for her were often rewritten to feature guest actresses since they felt the flirting between the captain and his assistant was inappropriate. Actress Grace Lee Whitney was also the subject of inappropriate behaviour from an unnamed executive, which contributed to her abrupt departure from the series.
I used to try to get you to look at my legs. Look at my legs.
Another semi-regular in sickbay was Nurse Christine Chappell, played by Majel Barrett. Christine appeared fairly regularly, doing nurse things, but was also a character who had a thing for Mr Spock, where he was constrained by his inhibitions.
Have you ever been engaged, Mr Spock?
But Christine had to instead watch Mr Spock lose his inhibitions from time to time with anyone but her. Barrett had been cast as the unemotional First Officer number 1 in the original pilot, but was not thought to have star power by either studio or network executives, who also resented Roddenberry casting his girlfriend in such a major role, since that never happened anywhere else.
Increase to full power!
Now with a blonde wig, Chappell appeared throughout the series, mainly in sickbay scenes as someone for McCoy to interact with on a medical level.
For so long, I've wanted to be close to you. Now all I want to do is crawl away and die.
Barrett also provided the voice of the ship's computer in many episodes.
Of all survivors, there are 9 actual eyewitnesses who can identify Kodos.
For the second season, a new character was added. The pop group / TV stars The Monkees were incredibly popular at the time, and as any conspiracy theorist will tell you, were clearly the inspiration for the Beatles, once you factor in time travel, space lizards, and serious mental illness into the equation. As such, it was figured a new, younger crew member should be added to the show to appeal to younger viewers. Ensign Pavel Chekov was assigned as the ship's new young navigator, complete with a silly wig that got slightly less silly as Walter Koenig grew out his own silly hair when it was slicked forward like many high school teachers of the 1980s.
Scotch? Aye. It was invented by a little old lady from Leningrad.
Chekov probably had the plumbest role in the show outside of the top 3 characters. He has his running gag about everything being invented by Russians, got to chase girls, and go off his head every now and then.
That's much better, Mr. Chekov.
His appeal to the youth of America was interesting considering Koenig was actually slightly older than George Takei, and both of them were only a few years younger than the rest of the bridge crew.
You started it, didn't you?
No, sir, I didn't.
Well, who did?
I don't know, sir.
NBC had originally not wanted Spock to remain a part of the crew. They were worried about his devilish look, so much so they even airbrushed his ears and eyebrows in early publicity material. They needn't have bothered. It was the ears that turned him into some sort of forbidden fruit devilish sex symbol. Nimoy and Spock were clearly the series' breakouts, with Nimoy receiving more fan mail than other cast members. This had several effects. Firstly, Nimoy used what little pull he had to make working on the show a little easier. Nimoy used the increased popularity to hold out for a pay bump before the second season. There was a small chance he would be replaced by another actor. Lo and behold, it was in fact NBC who insisted Nimoy be brought back.
Fascinating.
From this point on, Nimoy and Roddenberry's relationship would forever be tainted by mistrust between the two.
Fascinating.
William Shatner was no dummy. He had noticed Spock's popularity.
What is puzzling you, Captain?
I'm not puzzled, Mr. Spock. I'm awed.
And while it didn't sour the working relationship between the two to the noticeable detriment of the show, it did make Shatner, as the show's star, feel somewhat insecure, and this insecurity manifested itself behind the scenes.
I don't know how to get my crew back.
Something that had become an issue once the cast felt more comfortable in their roles was that both of the leads had developed proprietorial attitudes towards their characters and the series. In 1967, Roddenberry wrote to both of them, tearing strips off of them, basically telling them to pull their heads in.
I can't help how I feel.
Depending on who you asked, the atmosphere on the Star Trek set was either congenial or it was tense. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, or to coin a phrase, either congense or perhaps even tangenial.
All right, Spock. Whatever your game is, I'll play it. You want credits, I'll give them to you.
If you've watched Star Trek, it's very hard to visualize anyone else as Captain Kirk. If you've read any of William Shatner's Star Trek memoirs, it's very hard to visualize that any other actor, writer, or director had anything to do with the show. Writers were instructed to make sure Kirk always had enough lines, as the star would count them. In appeasing Shatner, one effect was lines written for the supporting cast were often minimized in order to give more lines to Shatner, which is why he sometimes seems to be finishing other people's sentences, or just cutting them off. It's interesting to note that the supporting cast sometimes got a lot more to do in scenes where Kirk was not on the ship. Resentment towards Shatner from the supporting cast would build up over the years, a resentment that he would later claim to be unaware of until about the 1990s. Actors are generally diplomatic while they're working or have the potential to be working, but years of convention appearances would see the supporting cast be progressively more open about their feelings towards the series star. It's a bit like that guy at work who rolls their eyes every time you walk past to get a coffee, but is otherwise polite and civil in meetings. Also, Frank, if you're watching this, bite me. The 1999 film Galaxy Quest has been cited by some non-fans as the best Star Trek film, but what it really is a movie about the cast who appear in Trek, and does a good job of showing their anxieties as jobbing actors and their resentment at being taken for granted by the series star.
So you managed to get your shirt off?
What a man gets up to in the privacy of his own Jeffries tube is his own affair, so long as he doesn't leave his communicator open. In the next part of our Star Trek video, we'll look at the individual elements of the show's production, writing, budgetary issues, ratings, and its cancellation. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Dead, 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 bottom, dead, 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 dead.